Ramadan begins and ends based on lunar sightings, exactly as it was done in Haran. Fasting occurs when the moon is not visible, and feasting occurs at night. Saying that the God is the greater, or Allah is the greater, comes straight from the context of a pantheon that calls Sin the greater God.
When you see these... to the 6th century BC, and we're going to be looking at people like Nabonidus because he has found some new material that now proves to us, or really strongly suggests to us, that this Ramadan fast, the fast that all the Muslims do once a year, that lunar fast called the Som is the other name for it, that is not unique to Islam. It has actually been borrowed. And it's not borrowed from anybody in the Hijaz, no, nothing from anybody in Arabia. It's been borrowed from much, much further north. But I'm not going to talk about it. I'm going to let Mel talk about it. Wait till you see what he's got. And this is these little nuggets that he keeps bringing forward, these historical antecedents are showing that Islam hasn't made up a thing. It is not even creative. It is just borrowing anywhere it can to try to put together this religion, and that's what man-made religions do. They don't get anything from God. They are not creative to do so. When men make up their own religions, they have to borrow right, left, and center. We've seen this with the Quran. Much of the stories have been borrowed. Now we're going to see it even with the 5 pillars, and here's another one of those pillars: the Ramadan fast. So.
So while Woody mentioned about another link, which was with Haran, and it was interesting because, you know, there was a lot of discussion about the map, and I didn't make too much of the map. The map that we showing Haran in a very central part of the overall world map from the 12th century. I thought that was interesting. I didn't think it was evidence really. It was more kind of confirmation of the centrality of this location.
This is what we brought in when we were talking about the word Mecca, from that 741, the 8th century reference in the Byzantia da Arabica, where it talks about the word Mecca, and then it comes halfway between Haran and Edessa, and that was that famous quote that Patricia Crone introduced in her book in 1987. And you saw that actually this word itself, this place, was actually right there in Haran. And that was where Ur is. That's where that's in southern Turkey. For those of you who don't, this is a modern map we're looking at. Am I correct?
Yeah, this is straight from Google Earth, and
Okay,
the place of old Mecca, according to my discoveries, was between Ur and Haran, so somewhere in between. But Haran has got its own tradition, which separate from the whole Abraham thing, which is to do with a moon god. And this is where my research went into.
See, these are real problems. She's looking at documents from that era. Now, what's interesting, she didn't read the entire inscription. If she'd read the entire inscription from Methodius, Continuata Byzantia Arabica from 741, if she read the second half of it, it says, as they consider it, that's Mecca, as they consider it, the home of Abraham, which lies in the desert between Ur of the Chaldees and Kara, the city of Mesopotamia. Wait a minute, hold on a minute. Take a look on a map where that is. There's Ur, which is just north of Edessa, and where Abraham came from was Haran. According to the people in the 8th century, they believe Abraham came from there. We know today that's wrong, because now we've discovered Ur. That was just discovered in 1853 by G.E. Taylor, the British discoverer. He discovered the city of Ur in 1853, and that is now today in Iraq. But back in the 8th century, this is where they thought that Abraham lived. But when you look and see where that is, that's in southern Turkey. That's way up north, hundreds of miles further north, proving that they've got the wrong Mecca, even in that inscription. Well, not the Mecca they have the right Mecca, but that's the first Mecca. That's the earlier Mecca. That's not the Mecca that we know today, because nowhere anybody, no Muslim listening to us, would believe that Mecca existed in southern Turkey. Too far north, once again, but directly above the present-day Mecca. And the original Mecca was located in southern Turkey or south of Edessa.
And it's threw up a lot of very interesting discoveries, and which I'll share with you now, really. So, Islam got the pre-Islamic Ramadan fast from Haran. This is another interesting discovery that I made, and I'm going to show you the evidence for this. And just so put this, we mentioned in an earlier video that Caliph Marwan II, who ruled from 744 to 750, he built his palace on the ruined site of the Temple of Sen in Haran. As you can see, it's way up in northern Mesopotamia, or southern Turkey, as it would be today. And according to this source from Britannica, Sen, or Nana, which in Sumerian, in the Mesopotamian religion, was the god of the moon. Sen was the father of the sun god Shamash, and in some myths of Ishtar, goddess of Venus, or Aphrodite, and with them formed an astral triad of deities. And it's interesting that St. John of Damascus links the black stone to a statue of Aphrodite. Now, Nana is also the Sumerian name for the moon god, and it may have originally meant only the full moon, whereas Suin, later contracted to Sen, designated the crescent moon. So essentially, Sen is the one that we're particularly interested in. Now, with that, there was an ancient Hajj-like practice. Each spring, Nana's worshippers reenacted his mythological visit to his father Enlil at Nippur in southern Iraq with a ritual journey, carrying with them the first dairy products of the year. Now, where is the Haran link? The city of Haran was settled around 2000 BC. The site of Haran was a hot, desolate landscape described even in antiquity as a dry, barren wasteland. The Sabians were also located at Haran, not just in southern Iraq or western Persia, as we mentioned on a previous video. Given these conditions, night naturally came to be seen as a welcome relief from the scorching heat of the day. Sun became the enemy, while moon a friend. No wonder that the Haranians built a temple to Sen, a structure that soon became a major landmark. The Sabians didn't really have a concept of week. They had days and they then had months. One of these was Rajab, roughly corresponding to March to April. Now, from the following book, The Knowledge of Life, the Origins and Early History of the Mandaeans and their relation to the Sabians of the Quran and the Haranians. It's quite a book title. The Sabians were divided into two groups, the Mandaeans and the Haranians. The Mandaeans were polytheists that had been living in Iraq since 2 AD. The second group, the Haranians, were moon worshippers that worshipped the moon god Sen as their main deity along with other deities, and they considered their god greater than the others.
Well, that's interesting. So what you're getting at is you can now see why the Abbasids, who then are the ones who are introducing this whole idea, that idea of their god being the greater god. You see where this is probably the antecedent to that idea as well, isn't it?
Yeah, well, actually, the Abbasids ruled from Haran at the very beginning before they eventually moved down to Kufa. So it's interesting that this idea was inherited from Haran.
So they took this with them, and they took these ideas with them. And as you're saying, also this antecedent, looking for what you're going to get into, they took this from up north and brought it down to what is today Iraq.
Yeah, and just to note, well, actually, it might be later. It's coming up, but the Haranians prayed down towards the south, towards Yemen. So this is obviously significant in terms of the later Mecca.
We brought this up in an earlier episode. I'll just put the map up here just to remind people. Remember, there's the arrow, that red arrow going straight down south. And where does it go down to? If you take from Haran in the north, it comes straight down to what is today Mecca.
Yeah. So Dr. Bayard Dodge, on page 78 of his book, The Sabians of Haran, explains that mythological origins of Haran's worship of the moon explained the disappearance of the moon after it joined with the star cluster Pleiades in the zodiac of Taurus. It happened during the third week of March. The people prayed to the moon, pleading for its return to the city of Haran, but the moon refused to return. This is believed to be the explanation for why they fasted during this month. The moon did not promise to return to Haran, but it did promise to return to Deir Kadi, a temple near one of the gates of the city of Haran. The worshippers of Sen went to Deir Kadi after this month to celebrate and to welcome the return of the moon. So, as you can see here, we see the origins of Ramadan, which was a 30-day fast, and in the context here, where it came from, we can see the purpose of it. They were fasting during the day, begging for the moon to reappear. So they ended their fast when they expected the moon to emerge at night. Okay, so what's interesting is they not only have all of these elements, but they didn't even bother to change the name much from the original feast. According to the 10th century historian Ibn al-Nadim, the Haranians called the feast al-Fitr, the same name by which the feast of Islamic Ramadan is called, Feast of al-Fitr.
So you've got the same... You really got the same word. They really haven't changed it at all, proving, I think this is a very good proof that this is where the antecedent is going back to. This is where the borrowing came. I mean, that's terrific that you've got, and I would have not thought that it would be the same word, but actually it is really the same word. The pronunciation would be the same.
Yeah. And what's interesting is the use of the takbirs. When Muslims celebrate Eid al-Fitr, the breaking of the fast, they also say numerous takbirs. In other words, Allah is greater. So that, the takbirs say Allah is greater, but it makes no sense if you believe in monotheism. But in the context of a polytheism, you're talking about the moon god is greater than the other gods. So now we see the meaning behind it. So, every time a Muslim is saying a takbir, they are committing shirk. You know?
This is fascinating because you remember we had an earlier discussion concerning the theological disputes that you see in the Quran against. In this case, it looks like it's much further north even than the Muslims are suggesting down south. Fascinating.
Yeah, no. No. So what happened was essentially the Iranian fasting moved in the calendar from Rajab, which is during springtime, to Ramadan in summertime. And Al-Fitr becomes Eid al-Fitr, which you can hardly notice the difference. Now, how did the practice get embedded into Islam? And this is where it gets really interesting. So this is really the proof that this is true and it's not just a coincidence. Long before Islam, this practice spread from Iran into Arabia through visiting Arabs returning home with these practices. The last king of Babylon, Nabonidus, who reigned from 556 to 539 BC, attempted to elevate sin to a supreme position within the pantheon. So he made it his personal mission to spread the cult all the way into Iraq and into northern Arabia, as we'll see shortly. Many Arabs were in contact with the Sabians, and they often went to northern Iraq, where there were many communities of Mandaeans, and they also went to the city of Haran in the western part of northern Mesopotamia. The pagans of Arabia started practicing Ramadan after it had been introduced to them by the Iranians. The month of Ramadan was called as such because of the warm weather during that month. You can see the sources where this is got from. Nabonidus started proselytizing at Tema in northern Arabia. In time, the last Babylonian king of Iran added more Arabian cities to his kitty, one of them being Yathrib. This later became Al-Medina. With Nabonidus also came the Iranian fasting and Al-Fitr. So he embedded this form of fasting into Arabia long before Islam began, and is clearly a pagan practice which was devoted to a moon god. Now, medieval historian Ibn al-Nadim documented various pre-Islamic cults of Arabia in his book Al-Farist. In it, he writes of various Al-Fitr rituals, including animal sacrifices and almsgiving. He also writes of prayers and ablutions. According to al-Nadim, pagan Arabs also prayed 5 times a day, but instead of Mecca, they faced Yemen. So this is another borrowing from the Mandaic religion. By the beginning of the 7th century AD, though, Iranian fasting and Al-Fitr were mainstream throughout Arabia, particularly at Medina. And what led us along this path was this post from Wild Woody, who I mentioned earlier on. He says, "I think Islam came from this region, as did all Abrahamic religions. We have been focusing on the wrong areas. Petra also plays a role in this sin cult." So here's where Petra comes back into the picture again.
Okay, I'm going to
He
stop
said,
right there. This is great. I'm going to put a map up right here just to show people what we're talking about. Look at this map there. And can you see where Haran is? Look at where Haran is. It's what is today southern Turkey. Now look where Petra is. It's over in the west there in Jordan. So everything that we're talking about does fit to what Dan Gibson's coming up with. It also fits to this notion that you've been bringing up, you and Murad, Mel, that almost everything we know about what Islam borrowed from is not from the area it should have borrowed from. It's not from down south. Take a look at where Mecca and Medina are. They're in green there. They're way down in the south. They're hundreds of miles away, 600 miles from, I would say, Petra, but 1,000 to 1,200 miles away from Damascus, and a good another way up in Turkey. I don't even know off the top of my head how many hundreds and hundreds of miles it is away. So this is much, much further north and much, much earlier. I mean, you're going all the way back to the 6th century. So just to put that map there, just so people are aware of what you're talking about, you're not confronting Gibson's material, you're actually supporting it. You guys are both actually coming up from two different directions and showing two different time periods, but two completely different parts of the map. None of them in the south, none of them near Mecca or Medina.
yeah. So the wilderness of Sen, which is obviously connected to this god Sen, the moon god, wilderness of Sen or desert of Sen is a geographic area mentioned in the Hebrew Bible as lying between Elam and Mount Sinai. Sen does not refer to sinfulness, but is an untranslated word that would translate as the moon. Biblical scholars suspect that the name Sen here refers to the Semitic moon deity Sen. So if you look at the map, just west of Petra is, well, actually northwest of Petra, you essentially find the desert of Sen. And below the desert of Sen, you find Paran, which is a very significant place as well. So it all fits really well.
Great stuff. Excellent.
So he also goes on to say that, remember that Muhammad's only miracle was splitting the moon. Who else can do that except the moon god Sen in the mind of doubting followers? So it's interesting that the one miracle associated with Muhammad is that he did something very much connected to the moon god Sen, splitting the moon.
Now, for those who don't know where this is in chapter 54, verse 1 in the Quran. Now, Muslims today say that he split the moon. If you actually unpack it and look at it in chapter 54, verse 1, you will see it is not Muhammad. It's not attributed really to Muhammad. It is really attributed to the last judgment, the end of times, that this is going to happen. But nonetheless.
So I got this from an article, a journal called The Haran Inscriptions of Nabonidus, which was written by C.J. Gadd. It was written in 1958. So 4 stela monuments were found in Haran in the foundations of a mosque, which were likely built on the site of an old temple dedicated to the moon god. These had inscriptions on them. With no regard for history, these had been placed face down or part of the paving or steps of the mosque, and it was Dr. D.S. Rice in 1956 who discovered them simply by overturning a stone. And as you can see, the inscriptions are labeled H1A, etc., H1B, and so on. But what's interesting is that there's a great metaphoric meaning to all of this, that Islam is essentially built on the foundations of paganism. And this here is a perfect example of it, where the foundations of this mosque are on an ancient pagan monument to the god Sen. Absolutely.
And it takes...
So they found various sculptures and so on in these stelae, but they also found inscriptions which were in cuneiform, that were transcribed and then translated. The inscriptions were by the mother of Nabonidus and by him himself. In other words, they obviously told the inscriber to put their message on them, so they're very important. And as with all royal inscriptions, they boasted of themselves very much. And so the first one here is from the mother, and she says, I laid hold on the hem of the robe of Sen, king of the gods. Notice that Sen is considered the most important of the gods. And she says, towards Ihulhul, the temple of Sen, which is in Haran, the abode of his heart's delight, he was reconciled. He had regard. Sen, king of the gods, looked upon me, and Namu Naid, my only son, the issue of my womb, to the kingship he called, and the kingship of Sumer and Akkad. I won't read all of it, but you can read it there yourselves. Now, where it becomes interesting, In the second one, H2, it's now his son who's talking, and he basically talks about how he went on a mission into Iraq. Now, what's interesting here, and he mentions also 10 years I went about among them, and to my city Babylon I went on in. At the word of Sen, king of the gods, lord of lords of the gods and goddesses, dwellers of the heavens, 6th century accomplished, all the way up to the 7th century when Islam began.
So 6th century BC, just so people are aware of this,
Yeah.
up until the 7th century AD. So you're talking about almost 1400 years. This whole thing is taking place. 700 years before Christ and another 700 years after Christ, or 600 years after Christ.
Yeah, essentially so. So in conclusion, Islam has co-opted a 30-day fast and a pagan festival from northern Mesopotamia, Haran. Every part of it references the moon god Sen. Ramadan begins and ends based on lunar sightings, exactly as it was done in Haran. Fasting occurs when the moon is not visible, and feasting occurs at night. Saying that the god is the greater, or Allah is the greater, comes straight from the context of a pantheon that calls Sen the greater god.
When you see these... see the Islamic traditions referring to these 5 pillars. These 5 pillars supposedly existed at the time of Muhammad. They were existed at when Islam was first was created. So therefore, in the 7th century is what they're saying. And yet everything we're getting is from the 9th and 10th century. We've always suggested that much of Islam has been borrowed from other sources. And we've seen these. This has come out in source criticism of the Quran itself, the many different stories, these story after story that you see of the great men of God. We know them as biblical characters, and yet when you look at their stories, they are nothing more than apocryphal writings. Many of them Jewish apocryphal writings. When you look at the person of Jesus Christ, reference after reference in chapter 19 and in chapter 3, where he makes birds out of clay and blows them when they fly into the air, when he speaks from the cradle, when he, in chapter 19, where he feeds his mother. These are not in our Bible, but they are in sectarian references, and then many of these are sectarian references from Gnostic accounts. And now what you're doing, Mel, is you're saying, yes, even the 5 pillars, when you look at the 5 pillars are also borrowed. The idea of God himself, the greater God, you brought that out in this talk here. You're talking about the whole Ramadan fast. Some people know it as the Psalm or the Ramadan. The Eid al-Fitr. You're looking at the word Fitr, and you're saying they haven't even changed the word. You're keeping the same word. This is the kind of stuff we're looking for. But you're saying this is not from the central part of Arabia that supposedly Muhammad lived in, and we now know that that name Muhammad has antecedents from much further north and west. East. This research that we're doing. So all of this now fits to a historical piece. This idea of a month-long fast. Now, you said it was in the summertime. That was when it's initiated. Once it became associated with the moon god Sin, that became following the moon god, and then became as long as that moon was there. And that's why today it keeps moving itself across the calendar. because it's following the lunar god, because it still has that antecedent to the moon god himself. Fascinating.